Lydia's voice, sharp with desperation, cut through the room. "Don't ever go to the ball alone again." Her words were urgent, full of years of frustration, but Ellanena hardly noticed. As she gazed out the window, the rain tapped against the glass, matching the dull ache inside her chest. 6 seasons, 6 long, fruitless seasons had passed. 6 years of disappointment, of watching her family's hopes of a successful marriage slip through her fingers like sand. The past 6 years had been marked by her mother's growing anxiety and her sister Lydia's relentless scheming. They were all too familiar with the consequences of another failure. Lydia, standing near the fire, her arms crossed tight against her chest, tried again, her voice softer this time. "Ellanena, you can't keep doing this. The ball tonight at Lord Ashworth's. If you don't make a proper appearance," she trailed off, but her meaning was clear. Another rejection, another season of invisibility would be more than the family could bear. It wasn't just about finding a suitor. It was about survival. The Witmore family's future hung on one last desperate hope. And tonight was the night. "Do you want me to marry just anyone?" Ellanena's voice was tired, yet sharp, as she turned to face her sister. She knew what was at stake, knew the pressure was on her, but she was exhausted. The idea of another meaningless dance, another empty conversation with a stranger, felt like a betrayal of everything she'd come to believe about herself. "I'm tired of pretending to be something I'm not." Lydia softened but then turned, her gaze drawn to the street below. There, waiting outside their modest townhouse, was a carriage, elegant and dark, the kind that belonged to men of wealth and power. It wasn't just anyone's carriage. It was the Duke of Ravenscroft's. Ellanena's breath caught in her throat. The carriage had been there for a moment, but she hadn't noticed until now. Her heart seemed to skip. The Duke of Ravenscroft. She had heard of him, of course. The man who had rejected every woman, who had thrown herself at him for the past decade. A man who seemed more myth than reality. But there he was, the very symbol of unattainable perfection, sitting just outside her window, waiting. Unbeknownst to Ellanena, the Duke was already holding a note, a crumpled piece of paper that had traveled miles to reach him. The note was simple but poignant. "You will have to do better than roses, Your Grace." It had been sent by a woman who had made it clear she was not interested in the usual displays of affection. A woman who wanted more than empty gestures. A woman who, in his mind, had become the only woman worth pursuing. But Ellanena wasn't aware of the note. She was too lost in her own thoughts, her mind swirling with what the night would bring. Her sister's frantic energy seemed to slip past her as she gazed out at the darkening sky. She couldn't help but wonder if the night would be any different from the others. The same hollow dances, the same hollow promises. 3 weeks earlier, on the night of the ball, Ellanena hadn't even known the Duke of Ravenscroft existed. Her life had been so centered around surviving society's expectations that the world beyond seemed distant and unimportant. Yet, that night, fate had intervened. It had all started at Lord Ashworth's suffocating ball. The glittering crowd, the chatter, the oppressive laughter, all of it felt like a performance. One Ellanena was too tired to play. She had escaped from the ballroom, seeking solace in the cool night air. The terrace was a quiet refuge from the showy spectacle inside. The moonlight washed over the garden, its silver light casting shadows across the blooming jasmine. She hadn't expected anyone to join her there. She certainly hadn't expected him. A stranger, tall and poised, appeared in the moonlit shadows. He didn't speak at first, but he had the air of someone who didn't belong in the crowd either. He wasn't like the other men who had offered shallow words of admiration. He seemed different. Something in his presence, in his silence, spoke to her more deeply than the usual compliments ever could. She had expected him to leave. Instead, he stayed, and they talked, not about the usual trivialities, not about the weather or the latest gossip. No, their conversation was deeper. They spoke of the artifice of society, of how women were reduced to performances, to roles they had to play. And it was during that conversation that she had delivered her impassioned speech about roses. "Roses," she had said, her voice steady despite the unexpected connection between them, "are what men send when they cannot be bothered to know a woman. Red for passion they don't feel, Pink for admiration they haven't earned. A rose means, I asked my secretary to handle this. They're beautiful eyes. The stranger had laughed. A real laugh, one that made her feel seen, not just heard. He asked her then, with genuine curiosity, what flower she would prefer. Jasmine, she had replied. At least it's honest about being complicated. And with those words, something had shifted. For a moment, the noise of the ball, the pressure of society, had melted away. There was no pretense. There was just a shared understanding between two strangers who, for one fleeting moment, saw the world the same way. But before their conversation could continue, they had been interrupted. The stranger bowed, as men of society did, and disappeared into the crowd. Ellanena had stood there, her heart beating faster than it had in years. For the first time in so long, she felt something real, a connection, a spark, and yet she never even knew his name. The morning after, back at the Witmore estate, everything had changed. Ellanena had sat in the modest breakfast room, watching her mother flip through the latest scandal sheets with a practiced air of detachment. Lydia had been chattering about some new dress or the latest gossip, but Ellanena had been lost in her thoughts. That was when the mention of the Duke's name had made her freeze. The Duke of Ravenscroft, her mother had exclaimed, seen in a private conversation on Lord Ashworth's terrace last night. Unbelievable. He's never spoken to a woman that way. Lydia had gasped. He's been rejecting every woman for years. The gossip's been wild. But Ellanena had felt something stir inside her, a flutter of recognition. She hadn't known it was him, the stranger. Not yet, but deep down she knew. The memory of their conversation, of his laugh, of his genuine interest in her words, haunted her. And then her mother had turned to her, a smile of desperate hope on her face. Lydia's our last hope. Ellanena, you need to make it work. You need to find someone before it's too late. But Ellanena had already begun to realize something. The Duke, whoever he was, wasn't just any man. He wasn't just another suitor to be dealt with. He had come to find her. And though she didn't yet understand why, she knew one thing for sure. Everything was about to change. What would happen when the Duke found her? Would he understand the woman behind the words? Or would she, too, be reduced to a rose, just another pretty lie in a world full of expectations? The answer was coming. And Ellanena had no idea how much her world would soon be turned upside down. The days following the Duke's public display of interest were a whirlwind, a series of events that Ellanena could scarcely keep up with. It had been 3 days since the Duke had requested a dance at Lord Harrington's ball, and yet it felt like an eternity. Her mind kept returning to his words, the way he had looked at her. Not as a lady to be courted, not as a target of affection, but as someone with real thoughts, real feelings. For the first time in years, she felt seen. But with that came the inevitable pressure of society's expectations. The next morning, as she was sorting through the stacks of letters that arrived at Witmore House, the butler entered with a large, extravagant bouquet of red roses. Ellanena's heart sank the moment she saw them, and she almost didn't need to read the card to know who had sent them. There was no need to confirm it. It was unmistakable. The Duke of Ravenscroft. He had ignored her rejection. He had completely disregarded her words. The roses, though undeniably beautiful, were a betrayal. The very gesture she had critiqued so vehemently, the very gesture she had rejected with such clear intent, was now presented to her as if she were just another woman to be wooed with flowers. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, and she couldn't stop herself from feeling a sense of anger welling inside her. Her mother's voice, shrill with excitement, cut through her thoughts. "Ellanena, you must be thrilled. The Duke of Ravenscroft. You must go to him. This is your chance, my dear." Her sister Lydia bounced with excitement beside her, beaming at the roses as though they were the ticket to her future. But Ellanena couldn't bring herself to smile. This wasn't what she had wanted. This wasn't what she had asked for. It wasn't about flowers or grandeur. It was about sincerity, about someone taking the time to see her for who she was, to listen to her words and understand her beliefs. With a sense of finality, she turned away from the bouquet, walking to her writing desk with a calm resolve. Her hands, though trembling slightly, wrote the note she knew she had to send. You will have to do better than roses. Your Grace. E.W. It was a simple response, but it was all she could manage. Her family watched in shock and disbelief as she handed the note to the butler, instructing him to return the flowers with the message. Are you mad? Her mother gasped. The Duke himself. But Ellanena stood firm. I told him exactly what I wanted. If he is listening, he will understand. The butler hesitated, but eventually left the room with the roses and the note, and Ellanena felt a sense of calm, a sense of rightness that had eluded her for days. But deep down, something gnawed at her, a fear that she might have just driven away the only man who could see past society's cruel games. At Ravenscroft House, Frederick Ashford, the Duke of Ravenscroft, stood by the window, staring out into the London streets, his mind racing. He had been anticipating her response, had known that the roses might not be the best choice, but he had sent them anyway. He had wanted to see if she would notice, if she would push back, if she would still stand firm in her belief that gestures meant something more than the empty traditions of society. And when the note arrived with the roses, his heart skipped a beat as he read it. You will have to do better than roses, Your Grace. It was clear now that she was exactly who she had seemed to be on that moonlit terrace. Someone who didn't care for pretenses, who didn't want to be wooed with the same tired, shallow gestures that every other woman seemed to accept without question. She wasn't like the others, and that realization both thrilled and terrified him. He had expected the roses to be a safe bet. It was what any man in his position would do. Send flowers, impress the lady, and move forward. But she had rejected them. And in doing so, she had shown him that she wasn't interested in the usual game. She wanted something real. He grinned at the thought. His friend, Thomas Sinclair, who had been watching him closely, raised an eyebrow. You seem pleased, Thomas remarked. Frederick nodded, his eyes lighting up with excitement. I am. She's the first woman in years who has forced me to rethink everything I've done up until now. She rejected my roses, Thomas, and I'm more certain than ever that I want to marry her. Thomas's eyebrows shot up in surprise. You're serious? After all this time, all the women you've turned away, and you're going to pursue the one who turns down your roses? Frederick's grin widened. Absolutely. She isn't interested in the usual charade. She doesn't want to be wooed with my title or my wealth. She wants to be seen for who she truly is. He turned to Thomas, his eyes filled with quiet intensity. I have to prove to her that I'm worth it. I'm going to do better than roses. I'll be the man she deserves. Meanwhile, at Lady Pembroke's afternoon tea, Ellanena couldn't escape the growing whispers that followed her. The ball at Lord Ashworth's had been a turning point, a moment when her life had changed forever. The Duke of Ravenscroft had publicly acknowledged her, had made it clear that he was interested in something deeper than the superficial courtships that surrounded them. But now, that attention felt like a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. The whispers followed her wherever she went, growing louder by the day. Lady Isabella Hartley, ever the antagonist, was particularly vicious, her cruel words like poison seeping into every corner of the drawing room. Oh, Miss Witmore, Isabella's voice rang out, sharp and mocking. I do believe you've caught the Duke's eye. How quaint. Ellanena's hands clenched around her teacup as she tried to ignore the venom in Isabella's tone. She had heard the gossip, of course. The wager, the charity project, the idea that the Duke was simply indulging in a passing fancy. She had tried to brush it off, but it stung. Every whisper, every snide remark, chipped away at the fragile hope that had begun to bloom inside her. But then, just as she was about to retreat deeper into the shadows of the room, she felt a presence, strong, unmistakable, and when she turned, there he was. The Duke of Ravenscroft, standing at the threshold of the room, his gaze fixed firmly on her. The room fell silent, as if everyone had forgotten how to breathe. Isabella's face contorted with a mixture of confusion and anger, but Frederick paid her no mind. He made his way toward Ellanena, his steps purposeful, and when he reached her, he paused for only a moment before bowing. Miss Witmore, he said, his voice low and warm, I hope to find you here. Ellanena's heart raced as she looked up at him, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and doubt. Was he playing some kind of game? Was he like all the others, Just another man out to prove a point? But then he spoke again, and his words sent a shockwave through her chest. I wish to ask you what you're reading today. The simple, genuine question caught her off guard. He wasn't asking about the latest fashion or the most recent gossip. He wasn't trying to impress her with his wealth or status. He was asking about her thoughts, about what she was reading, about what mattered to her. It was the first time anyone had ever asked her something like that, and it left her momentarily speechless. Her heart fluttered, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he saw her. He saw her for who she truly was. But before she could respond, Isabella's voice cut through the air, laced with venom. How sweet, she sneered. His little charity project. I give it a fortnight before he realizes what everyone else sees. Ellanena's chest tightened at the cruel words, but the Duke didn't flinch. His gaze hardened, and he turned toward Isabella, his face cold and unyielding. He didn't speak a word to her, but his silence spoke volumes. Then, turning back to Ellanena, he extended his hand. Would you do me the honor of a turn about the garden, Miss Witmore? The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Ellanena stood frozen. The room was watching, the whispers growing louder, but in that moment, all she could hear was the beating of her own heart. Would she take his hand? Would she trust him? Or would she let the doubts, the fears, and the rumors tear them apart before they even had a chance to begin? The days after the garden walk were a blur of emotions, uncertainty, and moments of unexpected tenderness. Ellanena couldn't quite understand why she was allowing herself to feel this way. She had spent years building walls around her heart, guarding herself against the disappointments and empty promises of society. Yet every time she saw Frederick, every time he looked at her with those warm, unwavering eyes, those walls seemed to crack just a little more. The walk in Lord Harrington's garden had been a turning point. There, amidst the flowers and the quiet hum of the evening, Frederick had stepped closer than propriety allowed, his voice softer, more vulnerable than she'd ever imagined a man of his stature could be. "Because you made me feel like Frederick, not your Grace," he had said, his voice almost a whisper. Just a man having the most interesting conversation of his life. The simplicity of the words, the way they echoed in her mind, made her heart flutter. For the first time, someone had seen her, not the spinster, not the wallflower, but the person she truly was. The idea that Frederick Ashford, the Duke of Ravenscroft, could be moved by her words, by her ideas, felt impossible, yet there it was. He hadn't come to her with the usual rehearsed lines or empty gestures. He had come to her with honesty, with a desire to understand her. It left her breathless, unsure of how to respond. She had never been one to trust easily, especially not when it came to men who had the power to manipulate hearts with a glance. And yet, with Frederick, she found herself willing to take a chance. Their next meeting was not in a ballroom or at a dinner party. Instead, it was at Hatchett's bookshop on a late afternoon in mid-April. Ellanena had retreated to the familiar comfort of books, a place where she could escape the ever-growing whispers of society and the pressure of the courtship that seemed to follow her everywhere. She was hiding, yes, but she was also yearning for some normalcy, for the simple joy of being lost in a world of literature. As she perused the shelves, her hand brushing against the leather spines of the volumes, a voice behind her made her jump. Still Seneca? It was Frederick, standing in the narrow aisle, a book in his hand. His presence, so familiar and yet still startling, sent a shiver down her spine. He wasn't following her. She knew that, but the fact that he'd come to the same bookshop every Tuesday for the past several weeks, without fail, made her heart skip. She turned to face him, trying to steady her breath. But before she could speak, he pulled a first edition of Seneca from a high shelf, his fingers brushing against the dusted pages as if they were treasures. For Ellanena, he read aloud from the inscription inside the front cover. "Who taught me that some women cannot be won with beauty alone, but must be convinced with substance." The words hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't the kind of declaration she was used to hearing. It wasn't about his wealth or his title. It was about her mind, her spirit, her challenges. It was about the way he saw her, not as a conquest, not as something to be won, but as a person worthy of respect and admiration. Her hand shook as she took the book from him, the warmth of his fingers still lingering on the cover. "I can't accept this," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "It's too much." He smiled gently, a soft laugh escaping his lips. "It's a statement, not a gift," he said. "A statement that I'm not playing the same game anymore, that I'm trying to do better, to be better." The rain had started then, softly at first, before turning into a steady drizzle. They moved to an alcove near the back of the shop, the scent of rain mingling with the musty, comforting scent of books. Ellanena couldn't help but notice how close they were now. His scent, cedarwood, faint traces of leather, was intoxicating. She had never been this close to a man like him before, and the proximity made her heart race, her mind spinning. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, the words barely audible over the sound of the rain against the window. Frederick's eyes softened as he took a step closer, despite the impropriety of the action. "Because you're the first person in a decade who's made me feel like trying," he said quietly. "Everything. I'm afraid you'll realize I'm not worth the effort." His words struck a chord deep within her. He was afraid, just like her, afraid of rejection, afraid of being vulnerable. It was something she hadn't expected from a man of his stature, someone who had everything, and yet seemed to be missing the one thing that truly mattered, genuine connection. "Then I shall prove you wrong," he said with quiet intensity, his gaze never leaving hers. "Every single day, if necessary." The rain had begun to fall harder, the sound filling the space between them. He reached out, taking her hand in his, the contact sending a shock through her body. It was scandalous, yet somehow it felt right. "Will you let me try?" he asked, his voice low, sincere. Ellanena's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to say yes, to let herself fall into this, to give into the connection that had been building between them since that night on the terrace. But something held her back. Something deep within her still feared the consequences of getting too close. She couldn't let herself believe in this. Not yet. But when he kissed her knuckles, his lips brushing against her skin with such tenderness, something inside her shifted. It was all too much. And yet, it was everything she had ever wanted. The next few days were a blur of stolen moments, brief rides through Hyde Park on the mare he had sent her, racing against the wind, laughing in a way she hadn't laughed in years. She found herself in his company more and more, yet each encounter left her more uncertain, more afraid of what this connection might mean. They had tea together at Witmore House one afternoon, and though the room was small, the parlor shabby, it felt like a palace to her. Frederick never once seemed uncomfortable by their lack of wealth. He complimented the room as if it were the grandest space in London, and when he praised her mother's teapot, chipped and worn, Ellanena felt a warmth spread through her chest. His kindness was both humbling and terrifying. She realized then that he was seeing past everything, past the societal expectations, past the superficial, past the judgments that others had placed on her. He saw her. He truly saw her. And it made her feel something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. They walked through the garden, her fingers brushing against his, the connection between them growing deeper with each passing day. The roses in the garden were struggling, just as her family had struggled, but they were still alive, still blooming. "This is what you meant," he had said, touching a wild jasmine vine that wound its way through the struggling roses. "I wanted to see where you grew up. The real you, not the ballroom version." Her heart squeezed in her chest. She didn't know how to respond, didn't know how to make sense of the whirlwind that had become her life. "Why?" she whispered. "Because I'm falling in love with the real one," he had replied. His smile was gentle, understanding, and for the first time in her life, Ellanena felt like she was enough, just as she was. But even as the connection between them grew, so did the fear. Society was watching. Every whispered conversation, every pointed look, every sly remark about their growing closeness gnawed at her. Isabella's venomous words from the ball echoed in her ears. Charity project. How long before he realizes what everyone else sees? The pressure was mounting, and with it, the fear that maybe they were right. Maybe he was just playing a game, just indulging in something novel before moving on. Maybe, just maybe, he would wake up and realize he didn't want her after all. But every moment she spent with him made her question that fear. It made her wonder if maybe, Just maybe there was something real here. Maybe this wasn't a game. Maybe it was something that could last. The ball at Lord Harrington's was exactly what Ellanena had feared. A cacophony of whispered judgments, a swirling mass of society's expectations and polite cruelty, all wrapped in satin and silk. She could hardly breathe in the suffocating atmosphere, the weight of the scrutinizing gazes pressing down on her as she moved through the crowded ballroom. Her eyes darted nervously around, settling on Frederick for a brief moment. And when their gazes met, it was like the world fell away. For just a heartbeat, she felt seen, not as the Wallflower, not as the object of pity or ridicule, but as herself. But then the moment passed. He was surrounded by others, as was customary for a man of his stature, and she was left to navigate the ballroom alone, lost in a sea of polite but empty conversation. Yet even among the guests, there was a palpable shift. The whispers had begun again, louder this time, as the public spectacle of the pursuit of her reached new heights. The murmurs followed her like a persistent shadow, and her stomach twisted into tight knots. She couldn't escape it. It didn't matter that she had returned his roses, that she had tried to show him who she truly was. No, society had already made its judgments. She was a charity project, the experiment, the one who had been chosen not for her worth but for her ability to amuse the Duke. And so she danced, albeit mechanically, her steps measured and careful, each one a performance. When the music shifted, signaling the next dance, she tried to slip away to a quieter corner of the room, hoping for a moment of respite. But as if by fate, Frederick was there. He crossed the floor, ignoring the polite applause of others, his eyes never leaving her. She swallowed hard as he approached, his figure cutting through the crowd with determination that left no room for doubt. He was coming for her, just as he had the night on the terrace, just as he had during their walk through the gardens. The moment he reached her, he didn't ask for her hand in a roundabout manner, didn't make small talk. No, he simply held out his arm, his gaze never leaving hers. "Miss Witmore," he said softly, the warmth in his voice a contrast to the coldness of the room. "May I have this dance?" She stared at him for a moment, a knot tightening in her throat, and for a moment she considered refusing him. There was a part of her that wanted to retreat into herself, to avoid the inevitable scrutiny that would follow their dance. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something real, something that made her hesitate. There was no pretense there. He wasn't offering her a dance for the sake of appearances or to prove a point. He was offering her something more. And so, with a tentative nod, she placed her hand in his, and together they moved the center of the floor. As they began to dance, the room seemed to fade into the background. The soft strains of the orchestra, the hushed whispers of the other guests, the clink of glasses, it all seemed distant, irrelevant. All that mattered was a connection between them, the way their bodies moved in sync, the way their gazes never wavered. For a brief moment, it was as if they were the only two people in the room. Their steps were flawless, their movements seamless, and the chemistry between them was undeniable. She felt a flutter in her chest, an excitement she hadn't known she could still feel. He wasn't just a duke. He wasn't just a man of wealth and power. In this moment, he was simply Frederick, and that was all that mattered. But as they danced, the whispers began again, louder now, more pointed. It wasn't enough to simply dance with her. No, society needed to make sure that she knew exactly where she stood in the grand scheme of things. And Isabella Hartley was more than happy to oblige. "How sweet!" Isabella's voice carried across the room, her words cutting through the music like a knife. "His little charity project. I give it a fortnight before he realizes what everyone else sees." Ellanena's breath caught in her throat, the words hitting her like a physical blow. She faltered for a moment, her foot missing the next step, but Frederick's grip on her tightened, his hand steady on her waist, and he gently guided her back into rhythm. His voice, low but firm, cut through the noise. "Look at me," he commanded. "You are not a charity project. You are not a joke, not an amusement, not a passing fancy. I need you to trust that what I see when I look at you is not what they see." His eyes held hers with a quiet intensity, and for the first time, she felt as though she were standing in the center of the storm, completely unafraid. He wasn't just dancing with her for the sake of it. He wasn't merely indulging in some temporary amusement. He was telling her, with every movement, with every word, that he saw her as something real, something worth more than all the gossip, all the judgment. "How can you know what you see?" she whispered, her voice trembling, unsure whether she was questioning him or herself. His smile was tender, almost sad, but filled with an unwavering conviction. "Because I see you, Ellanena. I see you in a way that no one else is bothered to. I see you for who you are, not for who society wants you to be." The words settled in her heart like a balm, soothing the raw wound that had been left by Isabella's venom. And yet, even as she allowed herself to believe him, the weight of her own fears remained. How could she trust him? How could she believe that this was real, that he wasn't just another man playing a game? How long would it take for him to grow tired of her, to realize that she wasn't worth the effort? She didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at her, but there was something in his eyes, something that told her that he wasn't like the others. He wasn't just indulging in a moment of whimsy. He was serious. "How long will that take?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, his face inches from hers. "However long you need," he said softly. "I'll prove it to you every single day, if necessary." The words were both a promise and challenge, and Ellanena felt something stir deep within her. She wasn't ready to believe him, not yet, but she wanted to believe that there was something real between them. After the dance, they retreated to the terrace, the garden beyond bathed in the soft glow of the moon. Jasmine bloomed nearby, its fragrance filling the air, a reminder of the first night they had spoken. He led her out onto the stone path, and for a long moment they stood there, the silence between them comfortable, not awkward. "I meant what I said," he said, quietly, his gaze fixed on the garden in front of them. "I know," she whispered. "Do you believe me?" he asked, his voice low, as though the word were fragile. She hesitated, her mind racing. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this was real, but the doubts lingered. The whispers, the judgment, the fear that she wasn't enough, they all weighed heavily on her heart. "I'm trying," she said at last, her voice barely audible. He smiled then, a slow, patient smile that made her heart flutter. "Then I'll try harder," he said, his hand brushing against hers in gentle, reassuring touch. It was then that Ellanena realized that the hardest part wasn't believing in him. It was believing in herself. She had spent so many years trying to be something she wasn't, trying to fit into a world that had never truly accepted her, that it was hard to imagine someone like Frederick seeing her as she truly was. Flawed, uncertain, and yet full of potential. But as they stood there, their fingers brushing lightly in the moonlight, she felt the walls inside her heart begin to crumble just a little. The connection between them was undeniable, and though she wasn't sure where it would lead, she knew she couldn't keep denying it. Frederick was trying, and maybe, just maybe, it was time for her to try, too. But even as she allowed herself to soften, even as she let the promise of something real take root in her heart, she knew that their journey wouldn't be easy. Society was watching. The whispers would only grow louder, and the doubts would continue to cloud her mind. But for the first time in a long time, Ellanena felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this time, things would be different. Perhaps, despite everything, she had found someone who would fight for her, not just for the woman society expected her to be, but for the woman she truly was. And that thought, small as it was enough to make her believe in the possibility of something more. It was a perfect spring day when the invitation to Lady Beaumont's garden party arrived at Witmore House, a day that should have been a moment of joy. But for Ellanena, it carried a weight that felt far heavier than the usual social obligations. She had already spent days struggling with the ever-growing anxiety in the wake of the Duke's continued pursuit. Frederick, though he had been nothing but kind and persistent, had brought with him an onslaught of whispers that spoke of everything from charity projects to questions of his true intentions. The weight of their gaze was becoming unbearable, and as Ellanena prepared for Lady Beaumont's event, she could feel a familiar knot of dread building in her stomach. It wasn't that she wasn't grateful for Frederick's attention, or that she doubted his sincerity. It was the world around them, the people who watched with hungry eyes, looking for any sign of weakness to pounce upon. It was a knowledge that everything she did, Every step she took was being scrutinized, judged, dissected. Lady Beaumont's garden party, with its sprawling lawn and meticulously trimmed hedges, was a microcosm of all that was wrong with society. The guests, dressed in their finest attire, their voices filled with forced laughter and polite chatter, only served to highlight Ellanena's increasing sense of isolation. For all her efforts to prove herself worthy of the Duke's attentions, it seemed the world had already decided her fate. She walked through the gardens with Harriet, trying her best to smile, to keep her posture straight. But the unease that had been building inside her for days was growing. The soft murmur of conversation was punctuated by laughter, and while the afternoon sun bathed everything in a golden light, Ellanena could feel the shadows of her own doubts creeping in. She couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. It was only when they approached the large pagoda in the garden, where a small group of Lady Beaumont's closest friends had gathered, that she felt the true weight of her fears come to life. Isabella Hartley, ever the Viper, was sitting under the shade of the pagoda with her usual entourage of women. Lady Margaret, Miss Thornbury, Mrs. Aldridge. They all turned to look at Ellanena as she approached, their smiles widening like a pack of wolves, sensing weakness. "Miss Witmore," Isabella called out sweetly, her voice dripping with false politeness. "Do join us. We're discussing the most delicious gossip." The invitation was far from kind, but Ellanena had little choice but to comply. Harriet shot her a warning look, but Ellanena ignored it, her legs moving as of their own accord. She felt the eyes of everyone on her as she crossed the garden, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her with every step. She couldn't breathe. The women at the pagoda all greeted her with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, their expressions more like cats preparing to pounce. As she took a seat beside them, Isabella leaned in, her smile widening with malice. "You'll never guess what we discovered at White's," she said, pausing for dramatic effect. "There's a wager in the betting books, Miss Witmore. About you." Ellanena's stomach turned, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt on its axis. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Isabella's eyes gleamed as she continued, her words slow and deliberate, each one designed to cut deeper than the last. "The wager is about how long the Duke will maintain his pretense of interest in you. The charity project," she added with a laugh, as though the words were something to be savored. "I'm afraid to say, my dear, but the odds aren't in your favor." Ellanena felt the blood drain from her face, her vision narrowing as the words settled in her chest like a stone. She had known, of course, that the rumors would spread, that people would talk, but to hear it so plainly, so cruelly laid out before her, was a blow she hadn't been prepared for. Her breath caught in her throat, and the laughter of the women around her grew louder, more vindictive. "Some say it's penance for past sins," Isabella continued, her voice laced with venom. "Others say he's simply bored, and you're novel. My personal favorite theory? He's proving that he can make any woman fall for him, especially a plain, penniless, aging spinster like you." The words hit her like a slap. Plain, penniless, aging. She wanted to fight back, wanted to scream, to throw all the hurtful words back in their faces. But she couldn't. She was frozen, paralyzed by the cruelty of it all. The glass of lemonade she had been holding slipped from her fingers and shattered on the stone floor, the sound ringing through the garden like a bell, marking the moment when her world came crashing down around her. She barely registered the gasps from the other guests, the murmurs of shock and pity. All she could hear was a ringing in her ears, the words "charity project" repeating over and over in her mind. "Did you really think," Isabella taunted, "that a duke could want you when he could have anyone else?" The question hung in the air, thick with disdain. "Everyone agrees," Isabella continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "This will end badly for you, Miss Witmore. But thank you for the entertainment. It's been quite a show." Laughter rippled through the group of women, spreading like a disease, infecting the other guests who had gathered nearby. Ellanena's heart pounded in her chest as the laughter echoed in her ears, the words cutting deeper with every passing second. She could feel herself shrinking, her whole body shrinking under the weight of their mockery. The world around her seemed to blur, the edges of reality fading into nothingness as her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. She had never been so humiliated, so utterly torn apart in front of so many people. The worst part wasn't the whispers, the jokes, or even the cruel words. It was a realization that the one person she had allowed herself to trust, Frederick, had been part of the very system that had brought her to this point. Hadn't he? Didn't he see the same thing that everyone else did? Didn't he understand that she was a failure? A woman who would never be worthy of someone like him? He wasn't like them. She knew that. He wasn't a man who would ever intentionally hurt her. But what if he was just playing a game? What if he had only pursued her out of boredom or curiosity, only to discover that she was nothing more than a distraction? The thought felt like a knife to her heart. She stood up abruptly, her legs shaking beneath her, and turned to leave. But as she moved away from the pagoda, she felt a sharp pain in her chest, a sharp ache that made it hard to breathe. She could hear Harriet's voice calling after her, but the words were distant, muffled by the overwhelming sound of her own racing thoughts. She fled through the garden, the whispers following her like wolves, each step making her feel smaller, more insignificant. She didn't care where she was going. She didn't care who saw her. She just needed to get away. She found herself in a maze of hedges at the far edge of the garden, and it was there, hidden behind a thick curtain of leaves, that she collapsed, her body racked with sobs. The tears came in violent waves, her breath coming in gasps as she crumpled to the ground. Unable to stop the torrent of emotion that had been building inside her, the humiliation, the pain, the fear, they all poured out in a flood, leaving her feeling empty and broken. It was then that she heard the sound of footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, and she knew without looking that it was Frederick. His presence was undeniable. He had come for her, but it was too late. She was already shattered. She couldn't face him. Not like this. Not after everything that had been said. And so, she remained hidden, her face buried in her hands, too ashamed to look up. Moments later, she heard the muffled voices of Thomas and the other servants, and then the soft, urgent exchange between them. Frederick was asking where she had gone, but they had no answers. The housekeeper reported that she had run away from the party, and Frederick's face turned grim. Thomas tried to comfort him, but the Duke was determined. He had to find her. He needed to fix what had been broken, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. What was he going to say when he found her? Could he undo the hurt? Would she even listen to him now? The world had already decided that she was unworthy. Would he be able to change that? Would she even let him try? Ellanena's bedroom was cloaked in darkness that evening, as the events of the afternoon replayed in her mind like a cruel, never-ending nightmare. The garden party had left her shaken, humiliated, and broken in ways she had never imagined. She had thought she was stronger than that the constant whispers and societal judgment wouldn't break her, but the venomous words from Isabella and the others had shattered the walls she had so carefully constructed around herself. The worst part wasn't just the cruel rumors or the public humiliation. It was a realization that despite everything, despite how hard she had tried to stay true to herself, she still wasn't enough. The Duke, Frederick, had been a light in the darkness, a beacon of hope for her. He had seen her, understood her, and offered her a chance at something real. But now, that hope seemed as fragile as glass. He hadn't just been a part of the world that had rejected her all these years. He had been the one who had introduced her to it. His attention, his affection, had been a reminder that in the end, she was nothing more than a charity case, a fleeting distraction, a woman who could never measure up to society's expectations. She lay on her bed, staring up at the ceiling, her mind numb, her body exhausted from the emotional weight she carried. The words charity project echoed through her thoughts, mocking her, reminding her that no matter how hard she tried, no matter how much she fought against the stereotypes and constraints of her station, she would never be enough. It was a bitter truth, one she hadn't wanted to accept, but now it was undeniable. She had hoped for so long that Frederick would be different, that he would see her as more than just a spinster, as more than just a failed woman with no fortune. She had let herself believe that there was something real between them, something that transcended the expectations of society. But now, she wasn't so sure. Had he only been toying with her, using her to prove some point, to make himself feel better about the women who had rejected him in the past? Had he really seen her, or had he simply seen a challenge, a woman to be won, a woman to be redeemed? The weight of these questions pressed down on her, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to give in to the crushing sense of despair that had been building inside her. She had lost everything, her dignity, her self-respect, and perhaps most painfully her hope. But even as the tears continued to fall, she couldn't shake the faint, stubborn voice at the back of her mind, the one that whispered that maybe, just maybe, she was wrong. Maybe Frederick wasn't like the others. Maybe he had truly cared. Maybe he still did. It was a thought she couldn't entirely dismiss, but it felt so fragile, so easily crushed by the harsh reality she had just experienced. She had already allowed herself to hope once, only to have it shattered. Could she really do it again? Could she put herself through the pain of trusting someone only to have it all fall apart once more? She didn't know. The next few hours were a blur. She ignored Lydia's frantic knocking at the door, the attempts by her mother to comfort her. Even Harriet, who had been her steadfast ally, couldn't break through the wall Ellanena had built around herself. The room felt suffocating, like a prison she couldn't escape from. She stayed in bed, staring at the walls, barely aware of the passage of time. Then, late in the evening, she heard the soft knock at the door. It wasn't the hurried, frantic knock of her mother or the tentative tap of Lydia. It was a deliberate, quiet sound that sent a chill through her spine. For a moment, she thought she might ignore it, pretend that she hadn't heard. But then the door creaked open, and a voice, low and filled with concern, broke through the silence. "Ellanena?" It was Frederick. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't want to see him. She couldn't bear it. Not after everything that had happened. But then his voice came again, softer, almost pleading. "I know you're in there. I just need to speak with you." Her breath caught in her throat. Part of her wanted to lock herself away, to pretend she wasn't there, to avoid the confrontation that was inevitable. But another part of her, one that she didn't want to acknowledge, wanted to open the door, to see him, to hear him. She fought with herself for a long moment, torn between the desire to protect herself and the need to understand. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she pulled herself out of bed and walked slowly to the door, her hands trembling as she gripped the handle. When she opened it, she saw him standing there, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with worry. He looked every bit the Duke in that moment, his posture straight, his cravat neatly tied, but there was something different about him now, something vulnerable. "I've been waiting for you," he said quietly, his voice cracking just slightly as he spoke. "I didn't know where else to go. I couldn't just leave it like this." Ellanena stood frozen in the doorway, unsure of what to say. She wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, to tell him how foolish she had been to believe in him. But the words wouldn't come. She wanted to hurt him, to make him feel the same pain she had felt in the garden, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. She had already suffered enough. "Ellanena," he continued, his voice more urgent now, "I need you to understand. What happened today, it wasn't what you think." The words hit her like a blow to the chest. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "The wager," he said, his tone filled with disbelief. "It's all lies. The entire thing. Isabella Hartley started it, and I—" He paused, his voice breaking for a moment. "I don't know how it got so far. I don't know how it became this public spectacle." She felt a pang in her chest. He wasn't the one who had started it. He hadn't been the one to spread the gossip. It had all been her own fears, her own doubts that had twisted the truth. But still, the pain lingered raw and unresolved. "Then why didn't you say something?" she asked, her voice shaking with a mix of hurt and confusion. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" He stepped closer, and for the first time, she noticed how tired he looked, how worn down by the burden of the day's events. "I should have," he admitted. "I should have told you sooner. I didn't realize how much it was affecting you until now." He reached for her hand, and despite herself, she let him take it. His touch was warm, comforting, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel the connection between them, the bond that had always been there, even when it felt fragile. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have done better. I should have proven myself to you." "You don't have to prove anything to me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm not the one who needs to be convinced. It's you who—" Her words trailed off, her thoughts too tangled to express. "It's me who needs to understand," he said, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I've spent so long building walls around myself, and now I've gone and built them around you too. I was afraid of letting you in, afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of failing." She swallowed hard, her heart aching for him. "But you're not like them," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "You never were. You never will be." He smiled faintly, but the smile was filled with sorrow. "I wish I could believe that," he said quietly. "But I understand now. I understand why you're afraid. I understand why you don't trust me." The silence between them was thick, heavy with the weight of their emotions. Ellanena's heart ached as she looked at him, her thoughts whirling. She had believed in him, in them, but now she didn't know if she could believe in anything anymore. Yet, in the depths of her soul, she felt something stir, something that reminded her of the woman she used to be. The woman who dared to dream, who dared to hope. But would she be able to open her heart again? Would she be able to trust him? Or would the walls she had built to protect herself keep her from reaching out? The uncertainty loomed, heavy and unyielding. But for the first time in days, she didn't feel completely lost. Perhaps, just perhaps, the journey wasn't over yet. Perhaps it was only just beginning. The following morning, the weight of everything that had transpired hung heavily in the air. The events of the previous evening had left Ellanena feeling exposed, raw, and vulnerable. But the lingering ache in her heart told her that there were still words left unsaid, and perhaps still hope. Frederick's confession had unsettled her, yes, but it also opened the door to something she hadn't expected to feel again. Possibility. He had come to her, admitted his flaws, and revealed the truth behind the rumors. His intentions had never been to use her, never to make her feel like a charity case, but to make her see him, truly see him, just as he had come to see her. Yet, in that same moment, he had also left her with the unsettling feeling that perhaps, despite everything, he wasn't the man she thought he was. His own walls had caused pain, but so had hers. And while his vulnerability had cracked through some of hers, the fear of what he might truly want, of what he might not, still lingered like a shadow in the corners of her heart. The truth, as always, was far more complicated than what the world saw. As the morning sun streamed through the curtains, Ellanena sat at the window, her mind swirling with the complexities of her situation. The room, though beautifully quaint, felt like a cage, and she could hardly breathe for the weight of all the unspoken words. Her thoughts kept returning to Frederick, his apology, his insistence that he had wanted to be different. The man she had met on the terrace months ago had seemed so much like her, so willing to break free from society's rules, to find someone who could see past the masks they all wore. But now, as she looked back, she wondered if she had truly seen him. Was he really the man he claimed to be? Or had she created a version of him in her mind that suited her needs, that soothed her broken heart? Could she still trust him after all that had happened? Could she trust herself? The knock at her door came unexpectedly, breaking her thoughts as if a spell had been lifted. She stood quickly, her pulse quickening, unsure if she was ready to face him again. But when she opened the door, there he was, standing in the hallway, his face drawn, eyes filled with a desperation she hadn't seen before. He was no longer the Duke of Ravenscroft, the man who had controlled every room he walked into. He was just Frederick, a man with a quiet but fierce determination to prove himself to her, even at the risk of losing her forever. "Ellanena," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "Please, may I speak with you?" She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest, but then she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The moment he crossed the threshold, it felt as though time slowed. She had invited him in, but could she still trust him? Would the truth he had come to offer her be enough to heal the wounds that had been opened? Frederick stood in the center of the room, his posture tense, but there was an openness to him now, an openness that had not been there before. He wasn't hiding behind the title, wasn't trying to convince her of his worth. He was simply there, vulnerable in a way that made her breath catch. "I know I've made mistakes," he began, his voice steady, but the anguish in his eyes told her that the weight of the situation was not lost on him. "I didn't understand how much my actions could hurt you. I thought that by following my heart, by being open with you, I could make things right. But I see now that I've only made it worse. I never meant to turn your life into a spectacle. I never meant for you to feel like you were part of a wager, a game. That was never my intention." His words hit her like a wave, crashing over her with an overwhelming force. She wanted to believe him. Truly, she did, but the pain that still simmered beneath the surface made it hard to accept the sincerity in his voice. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost to the point of breaking. "You didn't mean for me to be the subject of cruel gossip, for people to think I was just some experiment? Some game?" He flinched, the rawness of her words cutting through him. "No," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "I never wanted that. But I failed to see how everything would look from your side. I was so focused on my own feelings, my own need to prove that I could be more than just a duke, more than the man they all expected me to be, that I forgot to see you. I forgot to see what you needed." She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself, but the hurt was still too fresh. "And what do you think I need, Frederick?" she asked, her eyes locking onto his. "What is it you think I need from you now?" He stepped closer, slowly, as though afraid to push too far, to break something that was already fragile. "I think you need someone who will see you for who you are, not for your title, not for your wealth, not for any of the things society says you should be. You need someone who will listen to you, not just for your beauty or your station, but for your mind, your heart, your soul. I'm not perfect, Ellanena. I've made mistakes, and I'm sure I'll make more. But I promise you this. I will try every day to be the man you deserve. I will prove to you that I am not just a duke. I am Frederick, and I will show you that I could be what you need." His words were raw, vulnerable, and as he spoke them, something inside her began to shift. She had spent so long building walls around herself, around her heart, that she had forgotten what it felt like to truly let someone in. She had been so afraid of being hurt, of being seen as a fool, that she had never given herself the chance to trust anyone. And now, here was Frederick, standing before her, bearing his soul, offering her something real. Could she trust him? Could she take the risk of opening her heart to him again? Even after everything? She didn't know. But as she looked into his eyes, as she saw the depth of his regret, the sincerity of his words, something in her began to soften. She could see the man who had once listened to her on the terrace, who had spoken to her as an equal, who had made her feel understood in a world that had always dismissed her. That man was still here, and though she was scared, terrified, in fact, she couldn't ignore the fact that she still wanted to believe in him. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know if I can trust you." His expression faltered, but he nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I understand," he said softly. "I know I don't deserve your trust, but I will work every day to earn it. Please, let me try. Let me prove that I am more than the man who failed you in the past." She felt her heart beat faster in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps as emotion she kept buried for so long surged to the surface. "I want to believe you, Frederick," she whispered. "I want to, but it's so hard." He reached out then, his hand gentle as he cupped her cheek. "I know," he said quietly, his voice filled with tenderness. "I know it's hard, and I'm not asking for your forgiveness right away. I'm just asking for the chance to show you that I'm not the man I was, that I can be better. For you, for us." The silence between them was thick, charged with the weight of everything they had shared, everything they had yet to say. And in that moment, as they stood there, so close that she could feel his breath on her skin, Ellanena realized that she wasn't as certain as she had been before. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know if they were meant to be. But for the first time, she allowed herself to hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, the journey wasn't over yet. And maybe, just maybe, there was a chance that they could rebuild what had been broken, piece by piece. The uncertainty still lingered, but it no longer felt insurmountable. Together, they could find a way forward. And that, at least, was a beginning. The next morning, everything felt different. Ellanena stood at the window, watching the early sunlight filter through the trees in the garden. Her thoughts a mix of lingering uncertainty and cautious hope. The past days had been a whirlwind of emotions, confessions, and painful truths. But somewhere in the midst of it all, something had shifted. The Duke of Ravenscroft, Frederick, had opened his heart to her in ways she never expected, had shown her a vulnerability that made him more real, more human than the man of wealth and power she had once seen him as. He had come to her, not as a duke, but as a man who had made mistakes, who had learned and grown, and who was now asking for a chance to prove himself worthy of her trust. But it wasn't just the sincerity that had moved her. It was a realization that, in allowing herself to see him for who he truly was, she had begun to see herself differently, too. She had spent so long hiding behind walls, too afraid to let anyone in, convinced that she was unworthy of love or affection. But Frederick had shown her that she didn't have to be perfect, that she didn't have to fit into society's narrow expectations of who she should be. He loved her, not in spite of her flaws, but because of them. The thought would send a tremor through her, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something real. But despite the hope that had begun to grow in her heart, doubt still lingered, like shadows that refused to fade. Could she truly trust him? Could she allow herself to take the leap and step into a future with him, knowing the world would never stop judging her? Could she ever be enough for him, or would the weight of society's expectations crush them both? The knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She had been expecting it. She knew it was coming, but still, her heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the sound. When she opened it, there he stood, Frederick. He was dressed in his usual formal attire, but there was a different air about him now, something more urgent, more vulnerable, as though he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, and yet had come to her for solace. His gaze softened as he met her eyes, and for a moment neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, the silence between them thick with unspoken emotions. Finally he spoke, his voice low but steady. "Ellanena," he said softly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know you're afraid. I know that everything we've been through has left its marks on both of us. But I can't keep living with the fear that I've lost you, that you'll never be able to trust me again. I need you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I'm here with you, and I will prove to you every day that I am worthy of your love." His words struck her deep in her chest, and despite the fear that still clung to her heart, she felt a warmth spread through her. He was here. He was choosing her. And somehow she had begun to believe that he was right, that he could prove himself worthy if only she allowed him the chance. But she wasn't ready to let herself believe it completely. Not yet. She stepped back from the door and motioned for him to come inside, her breath catching in her throat. As he crossed the threshold, she felt her heart begin to race. This was it, the moment when everything would change. As he entered the room, he paused and turned to face her, his expression serious, yet filled with the tenderness she had come to cherish in him. "I know I've asked a lot of you," he said quietly, "and I know that words aren't enough, but I need you to understand something. I'm not offering you a life of perfection. I'm offering you a life with me, with all the mess and the flaws and the challenges that come with it. What I'm asking for is a chance to build something real with you." She swallowed hard, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She had been so sure of herself before, so certain that she would never allow anyone to break down her walls. But now, as she looked at him, she realized that the walls she had built had kept her from the very thing she had longed for, love. She could feel herself softening, allowing her heart to open in a way it hadn't in years. But the fear was still there, like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can trust you completely." His face softened, and he reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands. "I understand," he said softly, "and I'm not asking you to trust me all at once. I'm asking for the chance to prove that I'm worth your trust, that I'm worth your love, every day for as long as it takes." The sincerity in his eyes was enough to break through the last of her doubts, and for the first time, she felt the weight of her own fear begin to lift. She had spent so long hiding from the world, hiding from love, afraid of what might happen if she allowed herself to truly feel. But in that moment, she realized that love wasn't something to be afraid of. It was something to be embraced. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. "I don't know what the future holds," she said softly, "but I want to find out. With you." His face lit up with a smile that made her heart skip a beat. "Then we'll figure out together," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "One step at a time." Without another word, he stepped closer, pulling her into his arms in a way that felt both comforting and exhilarating. She could feel the warmth of his embrace, the strength of his presence, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt safe. His lips met hers in a kiss that was slow, tender, and full of promise. The world outside seemed to fade away, and for a brief moment, nothing else mattered but the two of them, standing in that room, together. When they finally pulled away, he took her hand and led her to the window. The garden outside was bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun, the flowers blooming in a riot of color. "I've seen the beauty of this garden," he said quietly, "but I've never seen anything as beautiful as you." She smiled softly, the warmth of his words settling deep in her heart. "And I've seen the beauty of Ravenscroft," she replied, her voice filled with quiet joy. "But it's nothing compared to what we can build together." He squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with love and hope for the future. "Then let's build it," he said, his voice firm with resolve. Together, and with those words, the future stretched out before them, full of possibilities. They would face the challenges ahead, yes, but they would do it together. The whispers of society would always be there, but now they had each other, and that, at least, was enough. As they stood together, hand in hand, the jasmine in the garden bloomed in full force, its fragrance sweet and intoxicating, a symbol of the love that had blossomed between them. The world outside might not have understood them, might not have believed in them, but they had found something real, and that was all that mattered. In the end, it wasn't about titles or wealth, about expectations or judgments. It was about two people who had seen each other for who they truly were, and had chosen to build something that was theirs, and theirs alone. Their love wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough.